Does your church start things but not follow through? We're talking about 4 reasons that may happen today on the Church Revitalization Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is Scott Ball. I'm joined by my friend and co-host, AJ Matthew. Following through, AJ, it's the bugaboo for, I think, almost every church. I don't know that I've met a church, big, small, doesn't matter. The number of churches that are able to make plans and execute on them is exceedingly small.
Yeah, and it's a shame because sometimes it's a heavy lift to get some of these decisions made in the first place. You know, gather people together, work through pros and cons of ideas, and finally come, and say, all right, here we go. And then for it not to happen, then, what a waste.
Yeah. Funny story. I will obscure the church. Hopefully, I don't know if anybody from this church is listening. I mean, no offense to if you are listening, dear church. But I once worked with a church in an unknown location that decided they were going to build like a Christian education type building. They were going to have classroom space and some other things in there, maybe children's ministry, I think. And they were gung-ho about it. They were really against bringing on any debt, which, whatever. I mean, that's their decision to make. They raised enough money to build the shell of the building. They were doing a pre-engineered steel situation. And they were going to finish the inside of it themselves. They were going to build everything on the inside. They were going to do themselves. AJ, they had built that 2 years before, I think, a year or two, maybe before I worked with them. And that was maybe 4 years ago at this point, 5 years ago, something like that. And it's still not done.
Yeah.
7 years. They've had this shell of a building sitting on their property. They got the shell up, got a roof on it, got all that stuff. Nothing inside.
Yeah. I've had almost the exact same story as well. Yeah. They're out there.
Yeah.
It's a shame.
Yeah. So this is, why does this happen? And, I think that the easy thing is to just say, oh, it's because of money or whatever. I don't even think that was it. You could say a lack of vision. Sometimes that's the problem. But we worked through that with them. So they had a vision for what that space could be. So I don't think that was it either. So what we're talking about in today's episode is we're going to talk about the 4 most common barriers for churches not following through on things. They make a plan and then they don't execute on that plan. There are a lot of reasons that this happens, AJ, but we're going to just chat and we're going to kind of bundle some things together, but we're going to talk about the 4 most common ones that seem to pop up.
Yeah, and these don't necessarily all apply to every type of thing that a church might be trying to do. They're kind of varied depending on what the nature of the change is that's happening, but they do come up over and over and over again. So let's jump in. Definitely the biggest one. It's a barrier to even decision making in the first place. But if you're able to get past that, it certainly could come back and bite you later on. But status quo, just kind of the way things are, just moving away from the way things are. One of the terms that, we jotted down in here, Scott, is inertia. So, coming back to like the physics, our physical world, and an object at rest, the energy that it takes to make something move that is at rest is greater than the energy it takes to keep something moving once it's moving.
That's right.
So this happens to people. So, this is not only a physical phenomenon, it's a mental and emotional phenomenon that happens when a group of people decide to make something change. So that's and so I guess making the decision to change is not the first piece of actual energy that makes something change. The decision is separate from the beginning the work to do something different. And so you can't assume that by making the decision, you've initiated some of the energy to make the object move.
Yeah.
You have not. You have only decided to move an object.
Right.
The energy to expel doesn't happen until you begin to actually do something. So that's why, this can be a barrier to something actually getting done in the church.
Yeah. And actually, the more you're saying that, I think the solution to a lot of these problems are all going to be the same. Like the barriers are different, but a lot of the solutions to this are the same. So, in answer to what you're saying, the solution to inertia is to make a plan. Like, put on your calendar, what am I going to do? What am I going to actually do? So, for that church, get the architect, have a meeting with the architect, set a deadline for when we need to file permits with the county or with the city or whatever. So those kinds of things actually spur on action, and inertia is a real thing. I mean, like it's a real challenge. In my experience, and yours too, I'm sure, AJ. This is the hardest thing for churches to get over. And it's why a number of years ago, we made a switch. We used to do a 6-month-long planning process with churches that we went through before we got to the implementation phase. And we've abbreviated that significantly in most circumstances, because what tends to happen is a church will go through, 6 months of planning and then feel like they've done something. And they've not actually done anything. They've just talked, which is the easiest thing to do. And but they have expended a lot of energy, emotional energy and, mental energy on it. And so they think, oh, we've done something, and they've not done anything yet. So we're trying to abbreviate how much time we spend in planning so that we still have mental energy for execution. But getting over that inertia. AJ, as it relates to status quo, I think there's two other facets of this. One that's more common in smaller churches, one that's more common in larger churches. So why don't you first address, I want to hear what you have to say, as it relates to smaller churches, tradition and our sort of nostalgia for that, or our emotional connection to that tradition, that's the driver behind status quo often in smaller churches. Why don't you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so tradition is an interesting word in the church, and it means different things to different people. So, you and I recently have been working with a Methodist church that has what people would refer to as traditions, in the way that they do church. Methodist churches around the world have things that they usually share in common, like their order of worship and,
Sure.
Some of the things that they recite and different things like that. So that's one aspect of tradition.
And those things aren't necessarily bad.
No, not at all. They're not inherently bad. No. Sometimes a church would say, we want to move more away from this set order of worship and this liturgical service into something that's, a little bit more free flowing, I guess, or not necessarily so rigid. So that's one type of tradition that they might come up against. But probably more commonly are traditions that, and I think what you were really kind of gearing more towards, especially in the smaller churches, traditions that they're not really rooted in anything denominationally or anything else. It's simply the way things have just always happened. And they'll throw, really the word always gets thrown around pretty loosely. Because always
it's been 25
always
years,
mean always.
Always, yeah.
Yeah. Always for as long as they've been there.
Right.
And they don't care what happened before they were there, and they don't care what happens after they're gone. They only care about while they're there.
Right.
But this could be all kinds of things, from, and it could get into the style of worship. People use the word tradition when we talk about hymns or organs and pianos and pews and these kinds of things. But it goes far beyond that. If service time, okay, so service time came up when the church I was working with this last weekend, and one of the stories that one of the pastors told was from a previous church. A woman was under the impression that worship happens at 11 a.m. on Sundays, and their church had changed away from that, and she would remind them of that.
Find that for me in here. Where is that? Where's that verse?
For those of you on the podcast, Scott's holding up a Bible. So you will not find 11 a.m. on a Sunday prescribed in Scripture anywhere. But that was a tradition in the church. That's what they would do, and that was meaningful, and that was a barrier for her mentally or emotionally, I should say, to move on from that. So there's just all kinds of things like that.
Yeah, I think in smaller churches, when we're saying, so this is still, we're still on point one, which is status quo. Getting like the status quo is a barrier. In smaller churches, tradition, and we aren't talking about hymns or liturgy; those aren't barriers necessarily. We're talking more about a sense of, well, this is how things have always been done. Namely, maybe in how, as it relates to policy and polity and practice and decision making and committees, these kinds of things can drag a church, slow them down. In larger churches, a status quo, an inertia that comes from the status quo, is often actually rooted in the staff, either the staff structure or people having a sense of, I don't want anything new added to my job description. You don't pay me to do this. Or a sense of, I'm the expert. Don't tell me how to do my job. I should be able to make my decisions on how I want to do my job. Didn't you hire me? Don't you trust me? And so there is a lot of conspiring, I mean that loosely, to just keep things how they are. And staff often don't want to make a change because they've become accustomed to whatever it is. So the way to tackle that challenge is twofold in my view. One, when we work with a church with a large staff, we want the staff to be the ones that are really highly engaged in that change process in the first place, so that they have an ownership in the decisions that have been made. I think that's very often the biggest challenge, is that a staff feels like, well, these elders or this group, they made decisions that then we have to live with, and they had no voice in it. So even if there's something that makes them uncomfortable, if they had no voice or no opportunity to speak into the process, I think it's a fair criticism for them to say, why didn't you ask us what we think? So when we work with a church that has a large staff, we want there to be good staff representation in the process. So that's one solution to that. The other is you have to hold them accountable to that change and make it a part of their review. Say, we're not paying you according to your job description or the job posting. Your position is connected to discipleship and process, to results. And these strategic changes that we're making as a church. We're making them so that we can become more effective as a church. And so you're being held accountable not to a job description, but accountable to the results. So we need you to get with the program, so to speak. And so you have to kind of hold the staff accountable to that. So I think status quo, we've spent the most time on this first point because I think it is the biggest barrier for most churches to overcome. It can be around tradition. It could be simply around inertia, where it's just easier to be comfortable and do nothing. It could also be your staff, if you're in a larger church, not wanting to change the way that they operate in a day-to-day work week situation.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Well, our next one is an inward focus in the church. This is definitely a common barrier to implementing positive strategies for change in the church. And this comes back, this is, has more of a spiritual implication going forward than some of the others. And when a church works with us through our strategic envisioning process, I mean, there's several facets to it. But the primary core driver is realigning with the Great Commission. Mm-hmm. So actually getting out and making disciples, introducing people to Jesus and then helping them develop in their faith. So when the church becomes very inward focused and hasn't necessarily been acting in an evangelical way, then that's tough to overcome. And not to be, overly critical or anything. This is something that happens over time. It's a slow change. But it's a difficult one to realign our thinking and our perspective on the world, and in some cases our actions and how we live our lives to move outside of this inward focus. Churches very, very frequently, they center all their decisions on just kind of what's best for us. How can we, realign something that we're doing so that maybe more people will get involved, but it's still only thinking as far out as like the present flock. So this is a difficult thing to overcome, because it's not only like decisions on how we're going to act as a church. It always comes back to how are we going to act as individuals, right? Which is we're all called to the same Great Commission mission in our lives. So this is a difficult one, Scott, to overcome an inward focus in the church. We can begin to do things, actively, and we can kind of like make changes, but it's a little bit of faking it till you make it, we have to agree, like, okay, we're going to begin acting differently, but we may not all capture it in our heart until a little bit of time has passed.
Yeah, it's a mindset shift. That's the thing about it. And it does in some regard have to do with planning and the kinds of decisions that you're making, but it really mostly is learning to ask different questions. So when it comes time to make a decision, instead of just thinking, well, how will people respond to this? What will people think about this? Not leading with that question. So thinking about, okay, if we change this service time, how will that impact people who don't go to our church yet? Is this an optimal time for them? What are the rhythms of our community? Or you're making a decision about, there's a church I've been working with, and there's been a lot of debate about what to do with Christmas Eve this year, just because Christmas is on a Sunday. So the question is, what do we do about Christmas Eve? What do we do about Christmas morning, Sunday morning? And, a lot of the discussion inevitably goes to, well, what will our people do? What will they show up for? What time works best for them? Discussion about staff, what time is best for staff? And then, I'm just thinking, what about someone in the community? What are they thinking? What's important to them? What are they going to be thinking on Christmas morning or on Christmas Eve? What time works best for them? Christmas is one of the 2 times a year where people are expecting to be invited to church. They're thinking that on Christmas, they're thinking that on Easter. So what time best fits their needs? And it's just a different way of thinking that most churches, especially declining ones, they're not thinking that way. And I'm not saying by any means that you shouldn't consider the needs of the folks who are at your church already. It's a little bit like a business only thinking about, sorry, this is maybe a little crass, but do you ever get annoyed, AJ, that all of the best offers for cell phone plans and deals on phones, they go to new customers?
Yeah. Like, how many lines do you expect me to add? My family's the size it's going to be from now on.
That's right. Can I add a line and then remove one so that I have the same number of lines? But all the deals are always to the new customers. And you're like, hey, I've been a customer with this cell phone company for 10 years. Doesn't that carry any sort of value to it?
Yeah.
And so I understand the need to consider the needs of the people who are at your church. We're not telling you not to. We're suggesting that most churches are so far on the other extreme where they're only thinking about the folks who are at their church. They're not at all thinking about their community. And that is a barrier to implementing change.
Yep, no doubt. All right, our third one is just distractions. We just let things take over time that should be more locked in to implementation. And this is the whole tyranny of the urgent issue that everybody deals with. If you're in any leadership position, whether you're in the church or at home, this happens at home as well. You're a mom or a dad or a husband or a wife, and the tyranny of the urgent happens in our daily lives as well. But from an organizational perspective, we just have got to plan better around that. And we've got to have our own, individual kind of policies in place for how we manage our time, in addition to kind of church-wide policies for how we address things and when they get addressed to keep this from happening. And it does, you all know that. No matter what you have on your calendar, some new email will come in or phone call, or someone walks into your office, and all of a sudden, that's where your attention is.
Yeah.
And even if it's a few minutes and it's, 4 or 5 times a day or whatever it is, 10 times a week, it's taken away time that you needed to be focusing on something else. And the longer you let that happen, even if it's like a few days, a week, if you had something on your calendar and all of a sudden it hasn't gotten done, the longer you go from coming back and getting it done, the more chance there is that it's just never going to get done. You're just like,
yeah,
all right, whatever. I'm just going to move on to something else.
Right. Yeah. That distraction is so key. We tell churches all the time that they ask us, what's the difference between success and failure on implementation? And the answer is the churches that keep meeting, keep working. The churches that stop meeting, stop working. And this goes back to planning, which has now come up several times. But put it on the calendar. When are we having an implementation meeting? When are we talking about this? In a church that's more staff-led, it's being very intentional about set the meeting agenda, the staff meeting agenda, before the staff meeting. If you let the staff meeting run itself, then it's going to be just carried away with the current of whatever is urgent. If you say in advance, we're going to talk about these strategic initiatives, these plans that we're making, where are we on this, that, and the other thing, then it's more likely to get done, because then you can raise something back into that category. So I didn't come up with this. I don't even remember who did. I think it might be Collins or one of those guys. But this idea of sorting things into urgent and important, important, not urgent, urgent, not important, and not important, not urgent, but having those 4 categories for things, that can be helpful. What you need to be sure you focus on is that stuff that's important but not urgent. That's the stuff that's most likely to drive you forward as a church, but is least likely to get done. And so, I just want to encourage you. Don't let I think distraction. Status quo is maybe the hardest, AJ, to overcome, because there's so much mentally and emotionally you have to get past. But I think distraction is the most common thing that just derails the average church. They just get distracted by running the week-to-week stuff, the day-to-day stuff, and they don't make time for the things that are important but not urgent.
Yeah, you're probably right. That's, gosh, that may be what Satan uses most in his work. Yeah. Even from our individual lives, the things that keep us from spending more time in the Word or in prayer or in helping others. Distraction maybe that's a good tool for Satan for sure. Yeah,
for sure. All right, we got one more.
Yeah, number 4 is people. How much are we? Sorry, Scott. How much are we getting into people today?
Well, okay. So that's a good point. We didn't say this at the front end. We'll say it now. We're actually going to do don't think of this as a 2-part series necessarily, but we're going to do a follow-up episode next week on implementations, focusing specifically on people, how to address problem people, what to do with people who resist change. And so we don't want to get too into the weeds right now on what to do with these problem people, because we're going to dedicate a whole episode to that next week. So let's just talk here, AJ, about what kinds of people tend to be the problem.
Yeah, and that's a variety. So, I mean, from the lady in my story that was convinced 11 a.m. is the time that worship is supposed to happen, those are more of the easy ones. That lady never left the church, by the way. She just was a constant complainer. To people whose behavior can even lean into the is this actually sin or not? In the way they are resisting change and the way that they're acting in an underhanded way. That's probably, more on the other end of the spectrum between, minor barriers to strategy implementation to major barriers. And then, individuals and small pockets of people. So yeah, these are all areas that can give you headaches.
Yeah. The pastor can be a barrier, depending on what role he's played in the decision-making process. Sometimes I worked with a church a few years ago. Gosh, I guess it's been several years ago now. We were doing leadership pipeline work in this church. And, as we were going through all of the work, he was saying he was supportive of it. I could see the tension in his own heart and mind with it. At the end of the day, when they got into the implementation phase, he just couldn't let go of things. The leadership pipeline work requires that the pastor be willing to let go of control over certain things and delegate down the pipeline. And he was not interested. When push came to shove and he actually had to do it, he was like, I'm just not going to do that. So the pastor at that point became the problem. Other staff can be the problem, where, again, I've seen this a few times where some staff buy in, they start executing. Other staff are maybe just procrastinators and lazy, or they just don't want to do it or whatever. And then what tends to happen then is the folks who have been working, they start to resent the ones. They look at them and they go, well, they're not pulling their weight. Why should I be busting my rear end for this change and they're not doing anything and there's no consequences? And so that can be a problem. So in a large staff situation, making sure that everyone stays on task and that everyone is moving forward together so that you don't build factions or resentment. And then obviously common people problems with constituents in the church, just complainers and people who don't like change and don't want anything new to happen. And to your point, though, I think that the percentage, AJ, there's somewhere, we've read this somewhere, I think in one of Aubrey's books. I wish I could go back and find it. But the percentage of people who resist change, who are never change type people, I'm never going to change, that actual number is relatively small. It's single digits.
Yeah. I think you're right. Yeah.
The vast majority, and there's some research. That's not a made up number. I wish I could remember where I read that. It's in one of Aubrey's books. But the number of people who will eventually get on board, or will complain but still go along, that number's quite high. It can be as much as 30% are your folks. But the number of people who will make enough of a stink and actually cause problems for you, they're 6%, 5%. I just think it's helpful for pastors to contextualize that and go, all right, am I really going to keep the church from moving forward for the sake of 5% of people who will never get along with this? Am I willing to endure the pain of 30% of people complaining who aren't actually going to leave or do anything about it? You know what I'm saying? You're basically saying, I can't tolerate I don't want to hear it, so I'm not going to do anything. And that's often what happens. Yeah. Pastors go,
yeah, it is.
I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear the complaints.
Yeah, that's right. Well, more on that. And, we're going to go through, how do we deal with these types of situations with the people barriers to strategy implementation next week.
Hey, will you
on
recap
episode
for us these 4 things?
Yeah. So today, yes, the four common barriers to strategy implementation. Number one are status quo, simply being able to move from where we are today into where it is we want to be. And that's not easy. The second one is inward focus, where everything has just been about us. And if we're going to be a church about kingdom expansion, then that has to change. But that's not easy sometimes. Third one is distraction, and that just gets all of us in our everyday lives, and it can derail your implementation as well. And then fourth is people who just are out there being human, and we have to address those depending on the level of severity in which they're exercising their humanness in resisting change. So those next week on episode 165, but today was 164, so you can read the show notes at malphursgroup.com/164. And we sure are glad you are with us. Always keep in mind, we are a nonprofit organization resourcing church leaders and pastors all over the world, and we would love to have your support in that. So you can go to malphursgroup.com/donors to learn more about how you could partner with us in your mission planning that we know your church is interested in too, especially as we come here to the end of the year and look towards 2023 and how we're going to use the resources that God's entrusted to us. Thanks for being with us. Can't wait to see you next week. We're talking more about implementation.